Hello, everyone, and welcome again. It's good to have us all together today, 28th of May, 2025, as we go into the 15th workshop in the anti-corruption series of 16 online Train the Trainer workshops being jointly organized by the Global Infrastructure Anti-Corruption Center, the World Federation of Engineering Organizations Committee on Anti-Corruption, and GlobeEthics MENA Center. I'm happy, delighted really to have us all together in this session as we'll be handling the topic on how to investigate corruption in the construction phase of an infrastructure project. I'm aware we'll be having some special guests also joining us in today's session. I bring you a warm welcome on behalf of the organizing organizations, and I pray that we have a good and insightful session together. As is our usual practice, I welcome you all to introduce yourselves, your name, your institution, which part of the world you are joining us from, using the chat box on your screen. In the course of today's interaction, please use the Q&A tab for any questions that you may have to the speaker, and our moderator, the speaker, and our panelists will do well to address them as much as possible live as we have time. Otherwise, they will be handled right there in the Q&A tab. My name is Susan Aka. I'm the training coordinator for this anti-corruption training of trainers program, and also the regional manager for GlobeEthics in West Africa, and also assisting with GlobeEthics in the MENA Center. So welcome again. Before we go ahead, let me welcome especially those joining on the panel, Mr. Kamal Ayadi, who will be doing the moderating, our speaker for today, Neil Stansbury, the co-founder and director of the GICC, and one special person who has been with us all through the TOT, Mr. Michael Kramer from the USA. So without further ado, I will hand over now to our moderator for today, Mr. Kamal Ayadi, to take over the sessions with our speaker for today. Thank you very much and welcome, Mr. Ayadi. Your audience, please.
Thank you, Susan, for the introduction, and thank you for all the arrangement to make this session happens. So I want also to thank Neil Stansbury, our speakers today, and Michael Kramer, our panelist. So today, this is the second to last session before the end of this journey that began 9 months ago. So I wanted to seize this opportunity to thank you all for your perseverance in staying committed to this training for such a long time. So today it's the 15th session, and we will address the same topic as last session on how to investigate corruption in the construction phase on infrastructure project. So without further ado, I wanted to hand over to Neil to start his presentation. Thank you very much, Neil, for your presentation. Thank you for your efforts. And please, you have the floor, Neil.
Thank you very much, Susan and Kamal, for your wonderful introduction and moderation. And great pleasure to be here again today, and welcome also to Mike Kramer on the panel. And I talk today about investigation of corruption in the infrastructure sector, but I'm acutely aware that Mike Kramer is perhaps one of the world leading experts in investigating corruption on construction projects, you know, from the Department of Justice and lead investigator for the World Bank for many, many years. And so it's a real pleasure to be supported by this on Mike Kramer. How we're handled today is very similar to 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago, the topic was how to investigate corruption in the procurement phase of an infrastructure project. And that is the phase of designing, developing the project, putting out the contracts to tender and awarding the tenders. And from now we're looking at what happens once the tenders are won, the contract is awarded, and the construction actually starts to take place. And although a lot of the investigative techniques are quite similar, the actual matters being looked at, of course, are quite distinct, which is why we break them into 2 workshops. And what we're going to do today is, like 2 weeks ago, we have 3 issues to be debated, which are being investigated by the investigators. And we're going to ask the participants, like we did 2 weeks ago, to type their opinions on the investigation at an appropriate time into the chat box, and then you'll have 5 minutes to type your opinions on the investigation on that issue in the chat box, and then Kamal and Mike Kramer will summarize the comments and give their own opinion, and then I will come back into the presentation and state what I believe the answer should be. So it worked very well 2 weeks ago, so we're going to repeat the same principles today. So what I'll now do is share my screen. And Susan, can we see it all up there on the screen? Thank you. So how to investigate corruption in the construction phase of an infrastructure project. And so we use today as a basis of the example a road project, but the same principles of investigation will apply to any type of infrastructure project. And those of you who took part in previous workshops will be aware that we had 3 separate workshops on the construction phase, one of which examined the different types of corruption which take place in the construction phase, in particular the big 3, fraud, bribery and extortion, which are major contributors to corruption on construction projects in the construction phase. And in another workshop we looked at how to prevent that corruption taking place. So now, having failed to prevent it, we're now going to investigate it and try and capture the perpetrators. And so looking into it, we're going to look briefly at the contractual structure used in this example and the road construction method, just so you know that the type of project we're looking at. And then factors in complicating the investigation and what you need to do to prove the corruption. Then we're going to look at the case study methodology and facts. And then we're going to look at various preparatory steps before you start the investigation. And then under 4, we're going to undertake the investigation. And as I mentioned, there are 3 specific issues which we will be investigating. Those of you who participated 2 weeks ago will, I'm afraid, see a little bit of repetition in sections 1 and 3, because of course there are great similarities in preparing for an investigation, whether you're preparing for an investigation in procurement or in the construction phase. What you need to understand and do in preparation is quite similar. So I apologize for a little bit of overlap, but I think it's necessary to restate it so that this workshop is a standalone workshop. So first of all, these 3 corruption examples we're going to investigate in this workshop are based on a road project with a quite simple but quite common contractual structure. We're assuming there's a public sector road agency who owns the road and is commissioning its development. It is responsible for maintaining and building the major roads in that country. It appoints, after a tender process, a main contractor to build the road. It also appoints a project engineer, and the project engineer, as we've described in previous workshops, will be wearing 2 hats. The one hat on behalf of the road agency will be to issue variations and approve works on behalf of the road agency, approve the quality, approve the quantities, will effectively be the project manager. The second hat, which often causes a conflict of interest, the project engineer is also wearing the independent certifier hat, where the project engineer issues extensions of time and certifies the value of work done, which can later be challenged by either the road agency or the contractor. So the strange but common conflicted role that the project engineer often has on a construction project. And then underneath the contractor will be the contractor's suppliers of material, aggregate, concrete, etc., and suppliers of equipment such as excavators, rollers. In addition, the contractor may appoint a subcontractor to do a specific part of the work, such as the asphalt top coat, in which case that subcontractor will also have its own suppliers. So quite a simple contractual structure, but not uncommon. And of course, in most projects, there may be many more companies involved in that structure than are shown here. And just a simple diagram of the road we're talking about, which has 5 courses. The main relevance of showing this diagram here is not for any technical purposes. It's to illustrate one of the key points on a road project, why they are so prone to corruption, is that you have a number of different bases in the road, number of different courses, which are built one on top of the other. Each course has a certain technical specification, has to be built to a certain depth and width using certain materials of a certain quality. If that is not done properly, the improper works are concealed by the next layer, and that is concealed by the next layer. So ultimately, you have a road where probably all you can see is the tops course, the surface course. You cannot see what's underneath. So effectively, you have a gift-wrapped corruption Christmas present, really, don't you? Because you can do whatever you like on the courses underneath if you're a corrupt contractor and cover it all with a lovely wrapping of the surface course. And people may not necessarily know, but then the road will break up. Then the question is why, and will the reason be discovered, and will the perpetrators be found out if they're acting corruptly? And therefore, these road projects can be so prone to corruption because of the inevitable construction method, with one course being covered by another one. Of course, you can test them, but these are difficult sometimes and can be expensive. So what complicates the investigation, I touched on this 2 weeks ago, is that investigators tend to hate construction projects. They tend to stay a million miles away because of a number of factors which make the investigation complicated, time-consuming, and expensive. And these factors are several, one of which is you have numerous companies and individuals involved in the project. We saw the contractual structure previously, but there could be many more companies than that. There could be the project owner, contractor, the engineer, subcontractors, suppliers, consultants, numerous parties involved, and you have to understand who fits in where, what they're doing. They're bound together, these participants, in quite a complex contractual structure with numerous contractual links. And the contractual structure doesn't necessarily flow top to bottom. You can have structures going beside each other. One contractor may be appointed to do some work, another contractor may be appointed to do another bit of work, and they don't have contract with each other. They have a contract with the project owner, but they're working side by side. Or they could be contracted with each other. So it's quite complex to know what the contractual structure is and what the obligations are and how these companies are bound together. The project can also be technically complex, which makes it very difficult to understand for anyone who's not a specialist in that type of infrastructure project. And that technical complexity allows the concealment of corruption, because the person perpetrating the corruption can say to an investigator who doesn't understand, oh, we did this because of A, B, C, D. It could be a total lie, but the investigator does not know that A, B, C, D is a lie because they're not experienced in the technical complexity. There also is an enormous amount of documentation on a construction project, which is very difficult to get to the bottom of. Even people working on the project often seem not to understand which document works where and how. There's such a lot of documentation. You could have the contract conditions, the specification, bills of quantities, drawings, program, delivery records, day work records, test certificates, payment applications, monumental number of documents. Also, for a road project in particular, the road may be in a location which is difficult to access. So the investigators may live in a totally different place to where the road actually is. And it may be quite time consuming and difficult to get to the road. And even if you do get to the road, if it's 10, 20, 30 kilometers long, it's quite a thing to have to investigate physically. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, work items are concealed by other items. The aggregate in the road base course is covered over by the asphalt surface course. Structural steel in any sort of bridges or anything, conduits, etc., are embedded in concrete, and so the structural steel cannot be identified, how thick it was, what its quality was, once it's covered over in the concrete. It can be, but it's difficult. It requires sophisticated testing methods. Also, generally, there's a general lack of transparency in the infrastructure sector, which makes facts and comparable data hard to establish. If you want to establish what a kilometer of road should cost, it's almost impossible, because you won't have a direct comparator of that exact type of road in that exact type of terrain built at exactly the same time. And also, not much data is published, despite the best efforts, of many construction initiatives to allow greater transparency. There's still a great reluctance to publish widely all public sector project infrastructure data. So these factors make the investigation pretty complicated. So investigators can tend to run a mile rather than get involved in them. And therefore, if they do get involved, it makes it difficult. How can they compare prices between projects if projects are so difficult in design and location? Sometimes projects are the same. You may have a housing estate where you have 15, 20 houses of identical size built in the same ground conditions, but it's unusual. Projects are normally unique, and therefore you can't get direct comparative pricing to see if the contractor is overcharging. Company ownership records are often obscure. There can be concealed ownership structures, owners using nominee names, companies registered in tax havens with no disclosure obligations. So you can't see who owns what. Does a public sector official in the road agency have an ownership interest in a subcontractor or supplier? Hard to find out. Also, corruption normally is a cause and effect, in the sense of there's a fraudulent concealment of defective quality or defective quantity, or a fraudulent variation or a fraudulent claim for an extension of time. But many of these actions depend on cause and effect to some degree. It depends on if there's an extension of time. It depends on finding out who caused the delay and what the consequence is. And you can't ascertain whether there's a corrupt claim for an extension of time unless you can ascertain cause and effect. And responsibility for actions and outcomes on construction projects is frequently disputed, even innocently, let alone corruptly, because people blame each other. The contractor blames the engineer blames the contractor blames the project owner, the contractor blames the subcontractor. Everyone blames everyone else for the actions and outcomes. It's quite hard to ascertain simple cause and effect. If you're looking for corrupt payments, how do you find them? They could be concealed in work documentation. They could be concealed in supplier documentation. They may be paid in cash, which is untraceable through the banking system. They could be paid through bank accounts and false names or nominee names. How do you find out whether the payment has been made corruptly or received corruptly? And finally, even if you battle through all these difficulties, how do you assess dishonest intent? Because what I've found as an investigator myself in construction projects, if you do find suspicious facts, the person accused will immediately, if the facts are clear, claim error or negligence. They will deny corrupt intent. They'll say, oh yes, we did supply the incorrect quality, but that was a mistake. We misread the specification. Or the supplier made a mistake. They supplied the wrong quality. And they claim mistake rather than dishonest intent. So we have to fight through all these complications. How do you prove it? There are three ways of proving effectively. The simplest and gold standard is an admission, is where an individual or a company puts their hand up and says, we did it, sorry. They'll normally do that if they're offered some type of immunity or concession or change of management in a company which wants to start with a clean sheet. So you have people self-reporting to the prosecutors and admitting what they did in return for leniency. Or cartels, for example, some territories allow full immunity to those who admit involvement first. So you could get an admission if you're lucky, but it's unlikely, very rare. The second, the silver standard, is witnesses. a witness comes forward who says, I saw that take place, and I heard the participants talking about it, and I know they're acting corruptly because of what they said. That's unusual. It does happen, but normally there's too much pressure on witnesses to admit. They may be worried about shopping their friends. They may be worried about retribution at work. They may, at worst, be worried about physical threats of violence, and at worst, death. So people are often not willing to be witnesses to any material form of corruption. So again, sometimes you get them, but it may be difficult. So the bronze standard, which is the most common in the construction sector, is the wonderful role of inference. Is that in most jurisdictions that I'm aware of, you can infer guilt from the circumstances. And what you need to do is to piece together sufficient facts, which when you put them together in the jigsaw, can only lead to one conclusion, that the parties were acting corruptly. There's no other rational conclusion you can draw from the facts you've assembled other than a corrupt act. And the courts allow inference. And obviously you need good evidence and good proof, but they allow an inference to be drawn. If you successfully draw an inference, then it reverses the onus of proof. And as you're aware, in criminal acts, the onus of proof is normally to prove the corrupt person is guilty. But if you can infer guilt, the presumption will swap, and then the accused party will have to disprove what you're saying. So what you're saying is, look at document A, B, C, D, E, F, G, put them all together. There's only one rational inference you can come up with, and that's a corrupt act. It's then up to the accused to say, no, there is another explanation, an even better one, and this is it. And they provide the alternative explanation. Then if the judge buys their explanation, then they will not be guilty. So inference is a very, very powerful tool and is often the only tool you will have in a construction contracts investigation. So what you're normally left with as an investigator, lacking an admission or witness, is the hard slog of going through the documents, going through the evidence, interviewing witnesses to try to build a credible case from which you can infer guilt. But what's interesting, I've found, is that it's not as difficult as you think, because the enormous complications I've just explained about the number of different parties, the number of different types of documentation, the overlap between them, etc., makes it very difficult to investigate, yes, but it also makes it very difficult for a corrupt perpetrator actually to make all the documentation and their corrupt acts consistent. Because if you are acting corruptly on a supply contract, and you're supplying false quantities, for example, you have a lot of documentation to falsify to make your corrupt act perfect. It's not, you have a whole range of documentation, purchase orders, delivery notes, trucking contracts, invoices, payments, payment applications, testing certificates. There's a lot which deals with the same aspect. And you have to be a very clever, corrupt person to make sure that all the documentation is consistent with your corrupt act. Also, you're going to have to pull in a lot of people into the corruption, because you're probably going to have to involve testing bodies, subcontractors, suppliers, truck drivers, etc., in your corruption. And the more people you try and involve in the corruption, the less likely it is that all the people are going to say yes, and the risk increases. They may give evidence against you. So it's very difficult, actually, I've found, for a corrupt person actually to make the documentation perfect. And also what we found is that corrupt people are incredibly careless in their actions. Often it's arrogance. They think they're so clever, they're so cool, they're big men, they're going to get away with it. They don't bother, they don't care. Or they've bought the approver, so they don't think anything can go wrong. They don't anticipate an investigation. Or they're just careless. They just don't check all the boxes. And so, you do get very, very clever criminals, but you do get a lot more stupid criminals. And, I've found in all the investigations we've been involved in that there's an incredible high bar of stupidity and carelessness in the corrupt acts. So ironically, although investigating corrupt construction projects is difficult for all the reasons I've mentioned, if you can be bothered to put the time and effort in to looking deep into the project and checking all the documentation, you pretty quickly come up with evidence of corruption. So persist, would be my mantra to people. Dig deep and you may well find what you're looking for. So with all those words in mind, let's have a look at the case study and look at some real examples, which I've converted into hypothetical examples, but they're all real. So this case study, we're going to look now at what records you should review, the expert support which you should obtain as an investigator, the personnel who you should interview, and the type of suspicious indicators you should consider. So from now onwards, you want you to imagine that you are an investigator. Put your investigation hat on. So the workshop doesn't cover every possible line of inquiry. Every case is different. We're just trying to give examples here of the types of inquiry that you should make. And of course, any initial inquiries you make may uncover further evidence, which may need further follow-up. We're not looking here either at what investigative powers you can use. Police have powers of seizure, search, etc., arrest. We're not looking at that. We're just assuming you can look at the documents and asking what documents you should look at. And also, in the following slides where I give examples of what you should do, I'm not saying it has to be in that order. It can be in any sequence, which is logical. So the facts of this case study is that the National Anti-Corruption Authority receives a report there's been corruption on a road project, which has been constructed by a contractor for the National Road Agency. So using the slide I gave previously, you've got the road agency at the top. They've awarded a contract to a contractor who's called Buildwell. Now, the National Anti-Corruption Agency receives a whistleblowing report about Buildwell. And the report says as follows: Buildwell did not construct the road in accordance with the contract specification. So the road has been completed. The whistleblower has come up after completion. And Buildwell and the whistleblower says the road wasn't built to the correct width and the road was not constructed to the correct depth. And inferior quality aggregate was used for the road subbase. And that the RA's site engineer was bribed by Buildwell to overlook these defects. Buildwell was paid in full by the RA despite providing defective work. So the whistleblowing report specifies 5 facts which look like they're interlinked because they're to do with quality and quantity, which suggest fraud, because if you don't build the road to correct width, not to the correct depth, and you use inferior quality, that could well be fraud by the contractor. But it looks like there could be bribery because the site engineer is alleged to have overlooked the defects. The site engineer should be approving quality and quantity and should have rejected any defective quality or quantity. But the whistleblower suggests the site engineer was bribed to approve them. And the whistleblower also suggested the road agency, the public sector body, paid Buildwell in full for the road, even though it was defective. So it's pretty suspicious. Now, the whistleblower is anonymous, so I'm afraid you cannot get any further information from the whistleblower. So let's just go through, before we ask you all for your opinion, I want to go through a few preparatory steps that you would take. First of all, you've received the whistleblower report. Who's going to investigate it? This is a public sector investigation. The anti-corruption authorities received the report. It's their duty to investigate. So obviously they would lead the investigation. But the road agency is very important in this. It's a public sector body. They may have overpaid Buildwell if it didn't carry out the work. It may have received poor quality road. So the road agency is a very important participant. They themselves want to get to the bottom of this. But bear in mind a risk here, because it could well be that the managers of the road agency are involved in the corruption. In fact, there's a suspicion that they are, because the They may be, because the whistleblower suggested that the road agency paid in full. They may have paid in full because they relied on the engineer, or they may have paid in full because someone was bribed. So be aware that the road agency may have corrupt people in it. But on the other hand, the road agency is not corrupt. It's a public sector body. It cannot be corrupt. Only its managers can be corrupt. So you still need the cooperation of the road agency. So it may be necessary to put people on leave, suspend them at the road agency. It may be necessary to put a couple of people in temporarily into the agency to investigate, because you need their documents, you need their help. Also of interest would be the tax authority, because if Buildwell received full payment for the road, but didn't build the road to the correct quality and quantity, that suggests quite a possibility they may have inflated their costs in their accounts for tax purposes, because they couldn't account on the basis that they had provided cheaper defective quality in their accounts, but still invoice the road agency for the full quantity and quality, because there's a mismatch in their accounts. So if they've falsely billed the the road agency, they've probably also defrauded the tax authority by falsely deducting too much expense from their income. So they would be involved, but I suspect the tax authority would probably stand back and say, leave it to you, anti-corruption authority, let us know what you find. But sometimes the tax authority has good investigators who can collaborate. So let's just assume the three bodies work in collaboration here, and you're the investigator appointed by them to do so. Now, the whistleblowing reports cannot be acted on unless it's plausible. You can't just justify initiate an investigation on any whim. If the whistleblower has given contact details, contact him, her, to obtain as much further information as possible. And you may be lucky. The whistleblower may give their name and address, in which case you can get more information from them. And sometimes you can get a lot of information from them. But that's probably unusual, because whistleblowers are nervous. They'll often report anonymously. If it's an anonymous report, it's quite hard to find out, to follow up on, unless the report is reasonably specific. But I think in this case it is. They've made 6 specific allegations, which I think give you enough to at least start the next phase of the investigation. So in this case, assume we have an anonymous report, but I think you've got enough, despite that, to at least go to the next stage. You're going to need technical experts, because they're talking quality of the road and defective construction. So you're going to need a technical expert. You may have a technical expert in your investigative agency. If you don't, you need to appoint one. For example, it's a road project, so a civil engineer could inspect the site, assess the contract and the records and the condition of the road, and suggest what tests should be carried out to check the quality and quantities used within the road construction, and then provide an expert opinion. So that's quite important to get an expert on board, so that to help you with the technical aspects of the investigation. You also need a commercial expert on board, I believe. Again, you may have one within your agency. If not, you need to appoint one, because you're going to have a problem here with project records. You're talking quality and quantity of a construction of a road, and that's going to be concealed or evidenced by a lot of documentation. And so you need an expert, probably a quantity surveyor or project manager, someone with road experience on the commercial side, who can actually dig into the records of the project and come up with the documents you need. Look for the inferences of corruption through inconsistency. And also they may need to assess the actual quantity and quality used and a reasonable cost, what should have been charged compared to what was actually charged. You also personally, even if you appoint an expert, I stress you should understand the project yourself. It's no good standing back and relying on experts if you are the person in charge. You should try and understand the project as best as you can. And what are you talking about? Understand the nature, purpose, and extent of the project. Understand who the parties are in the project and where they sit in the contract structure. You need to understand the contract, because if defective quality and quantity are being alleged, by what means do you judge defective? you judge defective by the contract and by the technical specification. So you've got to understand what the contract says. Otherwise, you may be investigating quality and quantity as defective when in fact it's actually in accordance with the contract. So understand the contract. Understand the contract conditions, the drawings, the program. Understand what type of contract it is, remeasurement contract, fixed price contract, based on bill of quantities. Establish how the contract works. And then from that contract, establish the scope of work of Buildwell. What did it have to do? When did it have to do it by? What quality did it have to use? What quantities did it have to use? And what method did it have to use? You don't need to be a technical expert, but just understand basically, with the help of the technical commercial experts, the parameters, because otherwise you will not understand the investigation. Understand also the program. What dates should they have completed by? When were specific milestones completed? What was the contract price? What circumstances entitle a change of the price? How were the works measured? And how were they paid for? So once you understand that, you are now ready to look even deeper. And then understand if any parts of the works were subcontracted. Buildwell may have not done the relevant work you're investigating. It may have been subcontracted to another company. That's very important to understand, who actually did the work. And if it was subcontracted, what were the subcontract conditions and who was it subcontracted to? So now you understand the overall picture of the project. You can now dig deep into the specific allegations, supported as necessary by the technical and commercial experts. So that takes us to the investigation. You're ready to go. You've got all the background information. You've got your team together. So let's look at the allegations one by one. And I've divided them into 3 specific pots. The first pot is any allegation alleging defective quantity and quality. So the whistleblower, who, as I stated before, is anonymous, you cannot get more information from them, sadly. They've stated that the road was not built to the correct width. Width means quantity and quality. Quantity because there'll be less quantity supplied of material if you build a narrower road. And quality because the road's meant to be a certain width. If it's less than that width, it's not the same quality in terms of width. The road was not constructed to the correct depth. If that is the case, that goes to both quantity and quality. If you don't go to the correct depth, you're unlikely to have used as a contractor the specified quantity of materials. And also, if it's the incorrect depth, there's a real risk the road is not of the correct quality and will break up. And finally, the third point, they suggest inferior quality aggregate was used for the sub-base. That's a very specific allegation. You know which base of the road you're talking about, and they're talking about the aggregate, and that, of course, is quality. Now, issues relating to quality and quantity are interrelated very strongly, because undersupply of quantity can affect the final quality, and also evidence of both quantity and quality can often be obtained at the same time from the same sources or records. So it's good to combine your investigations on quality and quantity, even though there's some slight differences in what you will do in relation to each. So now over to you, all the participants here, is you've got 5 minutes like last time. Put your investigator hat on. The 3 bullet points at the top, the correct width, correct depth, and incorrect width, incorrect depth, inferior quality aggregate. What are you going to do as an investigator with the help of your experts? Who are you going to talk to? What tests are you going to do? What documents are you going to look at? Type your answers in bullet point form into the chat box. You've got 5 minutes to do so, and then Kamel and Mike have the very courageous task of summarizing your suggestions. So thank you very much. So over to you for 5 minutes.
Yeah, we encourage you to share your opinion and to give your perspective about now. Can you go back to the previous slide,
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. Yes, it's better to keep this slide. Yeah.
It jumped by accident.
No problem. Yeah. If you were an investigator, and what would be the steps that you will take to establish the truth of this allegation? So we look to your perspective. Yeah. Hello, everyone. Oh, we don't know. We don't need hello, everyone, for this moment. We need opinion, please. Okay, the comments are coming. The first one, perhaps, is to check if there was a laboratory test for the delivered. Oh, sorry. Review what methods of proof were used to confirm qualities and quantities. Check the inspection evidence about width and depth. Revise documentation and test the road. That's good. Start by focusing on the easiest. Start by focusing on it's are coming. Comments are coming quickly. Yeah. Check the contract to see what the width should have been. Ask the contractor to state the width constructed jointly with the contractor. Visit the site to identify any discovery. Okay. You should master very well the specification of the contracts. That's great. Revise the supervision and forms and request a quality audit. Investigator can check purchase order along with payment certificates invoice to verify order quantities. Qualities can be verified by reviewing testing reports, such as what's this? Abrasion test, reports to verify aggregate strength. Similar tests must be done and approved by inspectors before constructor proceeds. The depth can be checked by coring. Okay, it's testing. Do you want to take some of them, Mike? Perhaps you have some of that you wanted to share.
Kamal, it's best let them have 5 minutes before you summarize. Maybe that's best.
Okay.
Yeah, I think we should be rounding up the submissions now. Let's give ourselves just about a minute and then we'll summarize the responses. Thank you. Okay. All right. Yes, Camille, would you go ahead with the summary of the responses? Quite some interesting responses we've had. Please go ahead with the summary. Yeah.
See, at least 3 categories. The first category, most of the participants, they focus on on-site measurement and to do the testing on-site to measure the width. And because it's easy to measure the width, and you can also measure the another kind of testing, which is this surface coring. check laboratory reports. This, I think, the first category of measures that could be undertaken to establish the truth. Another category, which is checking documentation, drawings, and compare drawings with the results on site. Another category, this, I think there are a number of other comments, but they don't fall under one of these category. Check the contract to see what width should have been. Of course, we assume that the width is specified within the documents, the contract documents. The width can be checked by measuring. I think there is the dominant category is to make on-site checking and coring and to try to establish whether the work on-site is done according to the specification in the contract. Mike, to you, if you have additional comments.
Yes, thank you, Kamel. Very interesting. I would just say that with this scenario of alleged poor quality materials, that we follow the following basic principles. Number one, we would want to thoroughly debrief the whistleblower. If the whistleblower is identified and available to be interviewed, it is absolutely important and essential in many cases to thoroughly debrief the person. Many times they don't include all the information they have in their whistleblower report, and so that would be number one. Sometimes the whistleblower evidence itself is sufficient. After you've done that, I would just follow Neil's instructions. Appoint the experts that are needed to do the inspections and the experts that are needed to do the review of the reports. And then the next thing to do would be compare the results of the inspection of the reports. In other words, the reports as to what the contractor claimed it did. First of all, compare that to the inspection results, obviously, to see if the contractor is reporting fairly, and then compare the results of the inspection and the examination of the reports to the contract terms. We often say that the essence of fraud investigation is not merely the collection of documents, but the cross-referencing of documents. So I want to see, obviously, of course, are the documents, primarily the documents which the contractor is preparing in support of its claim for payments, do they match the inspection results, and do they match the contract? If we decide that they don't, then we have a prima facie case. We still have to prove intent, but if they don't match, then the issue becomes a little bit simpler, and that is, how do we account for this discrepancy? Now, before we accuse anybody, we should probably check to see if have been any change orders, if any changes have been approved, that the contractor was told that it could change the width or it could change the depth. We need to check for change orders and approvals and so on with that. Once we've decided that that doesn't happen, and finally, at that point, we need to get into the interview. So once we have a thorough understanding of the actual facts, the documents, the inspection results, then we have to get into the interviews, starting with the low-level employees, the ones that would be more likely to be honest than the perpetrators, and then build through the interview process up to the top to try to obtain the evidence of intent. That's a very quick summary, but that's a lot more could be said, but that's a very quick summary, I think.
Yeah, there is another idea which it's about checking. I don't know who is checking materiality allegation versus cost of investigation, which I think it's a good idea before engaging in making the investigation. Try to check the pertinence of this whistleblowing, because sometimes whistleblowing could be intentionally made for other intention and not just for. Maybe they are not worth investigating. So this to to decide whether investigation is worth or not. I think this is also a decision that should be taken based on a number of factors, and the factor that is given in this comment is the cost of investigation versus the value from this investigation. If it's just minor defections, perhaps it could be just repaired by the contractor rather than engaging, because we know that engaging investigation sometimes could have a damaging effect on the relationship between contractors and the road authority, and it could also be damaging to the people who are working in the project, be they from the road authority or from the other side, from the contractor. So I think it's a heavy decision to, in some countries, I know that they don't take into consideration anonymous whistleblowing. So in some countries, they accept them as a source of information, but if they receive 2 or 3 anonymous reports for the same issue, they started to taking it seriously. Because in one single project you can receive in some countries, it depends on the context, on the culture and political context. In some countries you can receive a huge amount of whistleblowing reports. So it's a hard decision to decide whether or not we will follow up a whistleblowing report or not. So there should be some mitigatory factors to decide whether or not engaging an investigation after receiving a whistleblowing report. It's to you, Neil.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everyone, for your great comments, and Kamal and Mike for your great summaries. I mean, so many excellent points raised, so I won't cover them at all in summary again, because it has already been covered and summarized. So what I'll do is just move to my slides, which I put my opinions on what we should do next. But I think much of what has been said by the participants and Kamal and Mike goes even further and better than what I'm about to say here. But basically, in no particular order, inspect the site, visit the site, and measure the width of the road at a reasonable number of sample points. Does the measured width match the contract width? Are there any points, for example, from the drains at the side of the road, where it's possible to measure the thickness of the road or some of the road layers? Because sometimes part of the earth bankment has fallen away, and you can measure. Does the measured thickness match the contract thickness? Are there any visible defects in the road, cracking or substance, which could suggest the road was not built using the correct quantities and quality? Are there any stockpiles of material on site from which samples can be taken and tested? And are there any other visible signs of breach of contract by the contractor? So you want a site visit, which many people mentioned in the chat and summaries, probably as a first step. And your engineer, your technical expert would be extremely useful for that. Undertake relevant tests on the actual road quantities and quality. And the engineer, again, the expert, can recommend what types of tests. And Kamal's points, based on, I think it was Alex's point in the underlying comments, is very important value for money, because testing can be expensive and it can be disruptive. You may have to shut the road, you may damage the road, and therefore it's a very difficult balance between the cost of testing and the disruption it causes and the benefit you can get. But the trouble is, the other danger is if you take the decision not to test, not to spend the money, and therefore people get away with the corruption, you can end up with a corrupt road sector, because people know it's never going to be tested because of the cost-benefit analysis. So it's a real balance between cost effectiveness and deterrence. So there are different types of tests which the expert can advise you on. Non-destructive testing, such as ground penetrating radar. Destructive testing, such as core samples, can be done. The core sample is an excellent method of looking at quality and quantity in a case such as this, because there's an accusation of insufficient quality and quantity, in particular in the base layer. And therefore the core sample will drive a bore right the way through the road, top to bottom, and take a cylindrical sample out. And that sample can be taken away and measured and tested. And that is an excellent way of testing. But of course, then it's a question of sample size. If you have a 100-kilometer road, how many core samples do you take so as to be a representative sample of quality and quantity on the whole road? Very difficult decision. And as I said, a reasonable balance needs to be achieved between testing a sufficient sample to give a realistic picture of actual quality and quantity, the cost of the testing, the damage to the road, inconvenience to road users. All these have to be balanced together. But from the test that you do, whatever method you adopt and whatever you test, you are testing to identify discrepancies between the test results and the contract requirements. So if the test results show a difference from the contract requirements, as Mike said, you then have a prima facie evidence that the quality and quantity is defective. You then need to check whether the contract had been changed in any way, and if it hadn't, you then have a breach of contract. And then you need to look at further documentation to establish whether that breach of contract was deliberate, accidental, or negligent. But the testing is core to finding out whether there actually is a breach in quality or quantity as alleged. So review the supply documentation. So let's assume you have discovered that the road is defective, that the quality and quantity is not as stated. Let's look at how that happened and why. And this requires a pretty detailed forensic examination of the relevant documentation, as many of you pointed out in the chat. So, which materials are relevant to the complaint? Inadequate width and depth of the road, unfortunately, potentially affects the quantities of everything used in the road construction, because the depth and width will go the whole way, top to bottom, potentially, especially the width. So you may have to look at all supply components. Incorrect quality of the subbase only affects the subbase materials. So you need to look at what materials are relevant to the complaint. And then you need to obtain the documentation relevant to those materials. And that could be a lot of documentation. And you may need to obtain them from the road agency and or from the contractor Buildwell and or from the relevant supplier. Why do you need to obtain them from all three? Because there could be differences. And that's critical, because the corruption could lie in the differences. There could be a difference in the documentation recording the supply between the supplier and Buildwell. The supplier may be fabricating the documents, or Buildwell may be fabricating, or both may be accurate. So there are a number of options. So you have to look at all the documentation. What could these include? If we're talking about aggregate, it could be the purchase contract by which Buildwell purchases materials from the supplier, for example, from the quarry. Supplier delivery records of the materials to site, assuming that the quarry delivers the aggregate in its trucks to site. It has its own delivery records. Buildwell will receive each truckload of aggregate on site and will presumably have its own delivery records. The site supervisor will sign off each truck receipt. They probably should be day records from the site supervisor or project manager, whoever is keeping the records, which record what materials have been delivered and what use they've been put to. Then the engineer should approve the materials placed on site. There should be test certificates taken by way of sample throughout the duration of the project, establishing the quality of the supply. There should be an invoice from the supplier to Buildwell, which should state what was supplied in terms of quality and quantity and the cost. And there should be payment by Buildwell to the supplier. So your aggregate supply, if that's what you're looking at in the subbase, is going to be touched on by every one of those documents potentially. And it has to be a very, very clever contractor or corrupt person to make sure that all those documents are correctly fabricated to conceal the corruption. Very, very clever. And also, if all those documents are consistent magically, but the test shows that the materials were not delivered to site, then where the hell are they? Because, you know, is it the case that all those records have been fabricated corruptly, or was the correct material delivered and then stolen? But if it was delivered and stolen, it wasn't placed on site, and therefore the placement records are fabricated. So somewhere along the line, there's been a fabrication of documents if the test results or physical inspection shows that the quality and quantity is just not there. And if there's a subcontract, for example, if Buildwell used a subcontractor to do those works, those documents will be possessed by the subcontractor rather than the contractor. So get those documents. And then what you do basically is compare and look for inconsistencies. And this is somewhere where artificial intelligence would be brilliant if brought into play, because it's very time consuming to compare these documents. And I've spent many days, weeks trying to compare documents on investigation, you know, with QSs trying to see where the inconsistencies are. And whereas AI on an electronically automated contract could pick it up within seconds. But what you're looking for is inconsistencies. If the supplier supplied 1,000 cubic meters of a certain type of aggregate to site, what did it supply that in? Which trucks did it supply it in? Were there sufficient trucks actually to supply 1,000 cubic meters of aggregate? Was 1,000 cubic meters of aggregate received? Was 1,000 cubic meters of aggregate placed on the road? Were there sufficient types of equipment actually to lay 1,000 cubic meters of aggregate on site at that time? You're looking for inconsistencies which show that that quantity of aggregate was not actually physically delivered. And you compare all these documents with each other and with the test results and with the contract, and you're looking for inconsistencies. Now, to help you on that, of course, you want to find out what the contract quantity is, and the contract may specify the quantities actually physically in the contract or the bill of quantities, or you may be able to measure from the drawings. So simplistically, if the road is 10 kilometers long, 5 wide, and 150 millimeter thick for that layer, it's a simple mathematical calculation, the quantity in cubic meters which should be delivered. If that's the quantity that should be delivered, are there records from all the supplier delivery records and truck records and excavation records, etc., that show that that quantity was actually delivered and placed? And as I said before, if Buildwell charges the road agency for quantities which were not actually supplied, or if Buildwell actually charges the road agency for a lower quality, if it does it deliberately, it's normally going to have to get all of its supply chain and suppliers and staff to fabricate the underlying records. Otherwise, it's not going to be able to conceal that false documentation. So you're looking for inconsistencies. Dig deep and you will find it if there is corruption. And then those are the primary matters you should look at, but there are secondary matters which also can help. For example, the program bizarrely can give you clues about incorrect quality or quantity. Get hold of the contractor's program which shows the progress of the works. Does the program reveal any matters which are inconsistent with the quality and quantity records examined? For example, could you find that the program recording completion of a section of work records it having been completed prior to the delivery of the materials taking place, which could suggest that the delivery records have been faked and people put random dates on the delivery records without tying the fake delivery records into the contract program. So you could find inconsistencies in program and delivery records. Review meeting minutes, surprising what's recorded. So get hold of the minutes of the road agency, the project engineer, Buildwell, any subcontractor site meeting minutes. And they should record what's happening and any significant event. Do they reveal any matters which are inconsistent with the quantity and quality records examined or the test results? For example, do the minutes record difficulties with quantity or quality which are not consistent with the delivery records and work approvals? For example, the minutes may say, contractor said to supplier, you have delivered the incorrect quality on site, we're rejecting it. And that record of rejection could be actually after a fake acceptance note of quality, so therefore the documents are inconsistent. The minutes of meeting are inconsistent with the underlying documents. Or the minutes record the quantities as in accordance with the contract, but the test results on the road show that quantity and quality was not in accordance, which shows that the minutes have probably been fabricated, or the people taking the minutes are being lied to by someone. Look at correspondence. So all of this implies you can get hold of the records of all the parties involved, which normally involves some sort of police investigation. And I am actually involved, interestingly, in a police investigation at the moment. And I've been intrigued to note that the police managed to obtain all of the contractor's records from their server provider secretly. And so they were able to obtain a court order against a contractor and obtain all of their emails, all of their correspondence, all of their drawings, all of the stuff without the contractor knowing they'd obtained it. So a wonderful opportunity for the police to investigate. So get hold of their records somehow. Review the correspondence. As you are all aware, on construction sites, people can get very contentious. People fall out, get very angry with each other, put on the football shirts, etc. And there's a lot of angry correspondence alleging breach by other parties, threatening them with non-payment, threatening them with whatever. And often those letters, emails, text, etc. can be inconsistent with the amount claimed by the contractor in the payment application and the amount approved by the engineer in the payment application. So look for inconsistency between the contracts, correspondence, etc. Review equipment records. This is a key, actually, because all construction site activities require equipment to perform the major tasks. If you're excavating the road base, you need excavators to excavate. You need trucks to take the materials away, bring materials in. You need rollers to pack the material. And you need sufficient equipment on site to do it. It seems pretty damned obvious, but it's remarkable in how many investigations you discover by a simple calculation of outputs and a simple check of the equipment on site that the contractor could simply not have done the volume of work on site they claimed to have done with the amount of equipment they had on site, working the hours in the day they actually were working. So the equipment records of the contractor are critical to see what was on site, what the output of that equipment was, how long they were working for, and whether they could actually have done the work they claimed to have done in the time available on the dates available. And this is where you often find a huge inconsistency in contractor claims. If they do have equipment records which are consistent with the output, find out who the drivers were. Look at their personnel records on site and ascertain whether there were sufficient drivers actually to drive that equipment. If there were sufficient drivers, find out who they were and interview the drivers to see whether they actually were driving on the days in question. Obviously, this is a very detailed investigation, takes time and money, but this is the only way you can really get to the bottom of it, unless the contractor or other corrupt party has been really careless. Photographic records are very useful. People take a lot of photographs today, and mobile phones often tend to date stamp them, and therefore do the photographic records of the project correlate with the claims. So when the contractor claimed to have completed a certain amount of work on a certain day, do the photographic records back that up? Often they don't. And look at the payment claims, because this is the ultimate document, because there's a point at which the contractor can claim mistake. They can say, we made a mistake, wrong delivery, we were going to correct it. But once the payment application goes in, it gets very difficult for the contractor to claim mistake, because when they claim for payment, which is normally monthly or by milestones, and they're meant to be claiming for a specific amount of work done in a specific period with specific proof of what they've done. That is the point at which the contractor annexes electronically or physically or by cross-reference the supply documentation and the equipment records to a payment claim, to a bill of quantities, and claims for payment for that work done. Once they've done that, there's an expectation that the contractor has taken reasonable steps to ascertain the accuracy of their claim. And therefore, if the claim is for more than the work that was actually done, for the incorrect quality or quantity, there's a pretty reasonable presumption that that was a fraudulent claim, because the contractor should have known what they've done. They're attaching records which they should have checked were correct. And if they're not, it's a pretty hard hurdle for the contractor to overcome when they put the payment claim in. So look at the payment claim to see what they have claimed and what they've annexed to the claim for payment. Undertake personnel, just one point on that. Also check the engineer's certification of the payment, because what will normally happen is that the contractor puts a payment claim into the engineer. The engineer is meant to check the payment claim against the engineer's own personal observations and measurements, and is meant to certify the accuracy of the contractor's payment claim. And the engineer at that stage can reduce or increase the contractor's payment claim in accordance with the engineer's own records. Very rare they'll increase it, but they are entitled to reduce it. And the engineer should use all due skill and care based on their own records and observations to check the contractor's calculations and certify it. So if the engineer has certified the contractor's payment claim as correct, and if you have physical proof from the test results and inspection of the road that the claim is incorrect, you have a prima facie case either that the engineer negligently certified by not checking properly or was corruptly involved in the investigation. So very important to check these two certificates, the payment claim by the contractor and the payment certificate issued by the engineer. And then undertake personal interviews. As Mike was mentioning, interview all the key people on the site who could have a personal knowledge, the project manager, the procurement manager, the engineer, the supervisor, quantity surveyor, supplier manager, truck drivers, laborers, anyone who could be relevant, who could say, I was there, I did it, or I wasn't there, I didn't do it. And were they lent on by anyone to change documents? Were they lent on? And as Mike mentioned, junior personnel may say, I was told to say this, sorry, because they won't want to take the rap. And finally, that's been one hell of a job, made easier by AI one day. But to the extent you look at all the evidence you looked at, look at all the documentation, look at all the facts, and if there is evidence that the actual road construction in terms of quality and or quantity was not in accordance with the contract, and you've proven that by test results or physical results, and you've proven that the contractor claimed for quality and quantity which was not in accordance with the facts, then you have prima facie evidence of a defective road. It was not built in accordance with the contract. Secondly, you have prima facie evidence that the contractor claimed for payment for work it had not done. So therefore, you have a pretty compelling case. And so now your question is, can you infer corruption from that or not? And to do that, you need to look at all the cumulative evidence that we just talked about. And you have to make a decision. Do you think that the facts, all the documentation, all the consistencies or inconsistencies in interview evidence, does it point towards an accident, a total genuine mistake by the parties involved, the fact they built the wrong road and claimed the wrong amount? Could it actually be an accident, in which case there's no crime? Or could it be negligence? They should have known better, but they didn't properly check. It wasn't an accident, but they were just negligent. And that, again, is not criminal. Or on the other hand, was it deliberate? Did they do it deliberately? Or was it they just didn't care? They didn't care what they put in. So recklessness, deliberate. Then that is corrupt. That is criminal. And if you can point to all the documentation and say, honest judge, there's no way that all those errors and inconsistencies could have happened accidentally or by negligence. They must point towards a corrupt intent. The contractor must have known when it put its payment and claim in that its claim was incorrect. It must have known the quality was incorrect because it built the road. And look at those documents. They show that there's been manipulation of evidence because of the inconsistencies. And so therefore you say to the judge, please, judge, infer corrupt intent from these facts. And however much the contractor will protest, unless they come up with a better alternative explanation, which is more plausible, they will be convicted of corruption. So I hope that's been a sort of a good summary of how you can dig deep on a construction project and discover the hidden corruption. So moving on to the second point is the whistleblower also alleged bribery of the site engineer. Now let's assume you've proven the previous issue to a reasonable standard. You know as a matter of fact that the road was defective. You know as a matter of fact the contractor's payment claim was false. You know as a matter of fact that the site engineer issued a certificate approving quality which was defective. How the hell could that have happened? Really, the site engineer should have been on site, should have been checking. How could they have possibly signed a payment certificate which approved a quality and quantity which did not exist? Does that not imply something corrupt? Or could it just be negligence? Could it be that the engineer was too tired, too stressed, took leave, was sick, wasn't on site, signed the certificate without checking? Or could it be that the engineer made an accidental mistake, was innocent entirely? So what do you do as an investigator? You've got the underlying facts. There was a defective road. The contractor did claim payment for a defective road, and the engineer did approve the payment incorrectly. What do you need to look into to see whether the engineer accidentally signed the incorrect certificate or negligently did it by being too busy or unwell, or that they were corrupt, that they could, as suggested by the whistleblower, have been bribed? So can you just take 5 minutes now just to type into your chat box, and then once those 5 minutes are completed, perhaps then Mike and Kamel can summarize it.
Yes. But here, Neil, is it fair to just put the responsibility on the shoulder of the engineer? Because sometimes the engineer approves the quantity only because he has or she has some other assistant who make the work on site and who establish the quantity and the qualities. So it's with the engineer, there should be a team, because an engineer in this, he doesn't work alone to certify that and to give the approval for the payment.
That you could be right, Kamel, and that's one of the very important questions you'd be asking as an investigator, because it's been signed by the engineer. So I think that's one of your questions. That's a very good one.
Yeah.
Could the engineer be relying on a deputy? In which case, was the deputy negligent or corrupt? Or
Yeah,
was
particularly when you are sorry, go ahead, Neil, please.
No, just say so. So that's one, as an investigator, that's one important question you need to look at. Who signed? What did they know?
Absolutely, yes. Particularly in project when you have multiple sites.
Yes.
And the project is spread across multiple sites, and you need to have, and sometimes between two sites, you have perhaps 400 kilometers in highways or in, so he should rely on other assistant to supervise the work on site. And this is the way that it happens usually.
Correct. So as the investigator, this is one point you'll be looking at for sure.
All All right, so we have about 2 minutes more, then we summarize this session, please. Thank you.
We may give them more time, Susan, perhaps.
No, we still
yeah.
have a couple of slides to cover, and we have another issue to also handle, and our time is also running. Yeah, pardon that. Right. Let's round up now with our submissions, and over to you, please, Camille and Michael. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. We have less comments than the first case, and I see 2 or 3 categories. The first, some of the participants.
Camille, please, your sound is going.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, okay, wonderful. Thank you. Better now.
Comments are still coming, yeah. The first is about do check on-site records. 2 or 3 comments are suggesting that we need to do further and comprehensive check on-site records and check who signed and who approved the jobs and the payments. Find out the means of bribe, which participants were responsible. Yeah. We still have comments are coming. Yeah. Focus on the claim of payment, photos, and interview, do some interview of people on site, and to try to identify some witnesses. Do you want to give additional comments, Synthesis Mike?
Yes, it's difficult to prove bribes. That's for sure. And so it's very hard to summarize that in just a couple of minutes. But for very basic points, once you've established the predicate, once you've established that there's a reason to suspect bribery, as Neil said, namely the circumstantial evidence that false claims were submitted and approved by the engineer, and there's no logical explanation as to why he or she would do that, then in my experience, what you would look at would be email records. In many instances, believe it or not, demands for bribes or complaints about bribes are reflected in emails. So you want to check that. Secondly, some witnesses or some people that pay bribes may be unhappy about that. It may be a situation where the site engineer has approached an otherwise legitimate, honest company and honest employees and demanded bribes. And the employees and companies thought they had no alternative except to pay or lose the contract. And so in some cases I've had, when you interview the The people that paid the bribe, under the assurance that if they cooperate completely, they'll be treated fairly, they will admit that they paid the bribe. And what they'll do is they'll characterize it as extortion. They'll say, this really wasn't a bribe. This was demanded. We paid it. We shouldn't have done that, but we did. And then finally, if there's no record in the emails, there's no witness to talk to, of course, get the contractor's records. If they're paying bribes on a large contract, the bribes may be substantial. They're going to have to go through some procedures to generate the bribe money, namely overcharges and so on. So when you get the contractor's records of the project and also its financial records, as I'm sure Neil has mentioned, you get his financial records, you will see suspect payments that, based on your knowledge of the project, don't make sense. These payments may not go directly to a site engineer. They may go to a shell company. They may be payments turned into cash, but obviously get the contractor's financial records to see if there's any transactions there, which are the bribe payments.
Thanks very much, Mike and Kamal. I mean, that's great. Some great comments there. And I think it's summarized in a nutshell. So I'll just sort of summarize my points in a way. So what we're saying here is we know as a fact the road was defective. We know as a fact the contractor made a claim for full payment incorrectly. We know as a fact the engineer approved it wrongly. So the only question is, were they acting innocently, negligently, or corruptly? So I think, as Kamal touched on at the beginning, identify the role of the site engineer, because it could well be the site engineer himself or herself was not the right person monitoring. It could have been a deputy or another person in the organization. So work out what the role of the site engineer was, who the engineer was, who was observing, and interview them as to how much time they spent on site, what steps they were meant to take to verify and record quantity and quality, because surely they are approving quality and quantity on behalf of the road agency. Surely they're meant to witness it in some way, or a deputy is meant to witness it. So why did they approve it when it was incorrect? So what steps should they have taken? And then compare that with the steps they actually took to verify and record quantity and quality. Did they personally verify? Did they measure? Did they take photographs? Did they do tests? What certificates were issued? Did any deputies do it on their behalf? Were they instructed by anyone else to approve quantity or quality, even if they weren't happy? You know, for example, did the road agency chief executive say to them, just approve it? And if you want a job in the future, then approve it and just turn a blind eye to things. Did someone make them act corruptly? And also, as Mike mentioned, were they receiving any payments, from Buildwell, gifts, hospitality, or anything in connection with the project? So what you're looking for is, as a fact, they signed incorrectly. You're looking for pointers to see whether they were overwhelmed with work, just totally tired, didn't check, weren't acting corruptly, but they were stupid. They should never have signed, or whether it was something worse. And if you can find evidence in any way of gifts, hospitality, or critically cash payments, then I think it's dead and buried. That if they've received a cash payment from the contractor or excessive gifts and hospitality, the inference is almost inescapable. You have an engineer who's meant to verify quality and quantity, doesn't do so, incorrectly signed a certificate of approval, and was entertained lavishly by the contractor. I think the inference is inescapable that they're acting corruptly. So you need to look at their records. So investigate the bank accounts of the engineer. Did they receive any payments? Investigate the bank account of Buildwell. Did they make any suspicious payments which could have gone to the engineer? Assess inconsistency between what they claim to have done and what they actually did. Interview other personnel to assess whether they saw anything suspicious, like the engineer being entertained by the contractor. And then look at all the evidence and say, okay, we know for a fact the engineer made incorrectly certified. Look at all the evidence we've got of gifts, hospitality, payments, what they did, inconsistencies in the documents, and can we draw from that an inference of corruption? Or was it just a very tired engineer making a mistake or acting negligently, but with no corrupt intent. And I can't speculate here based on the facts we have, but you should, from your investigation, be able to draw an inference of either accidental or negligent or deliberate. And as I mentioned before, if you have the fact of an engineer signing an incorrect certificate, and you have the fact of a cash receipt or entertainment or gifts, I think the inference is inescapable. And then finally, what I'm going to do here is, because we're running a bit short of time, we want a bit of time at the end for questions. I won't throw this question open to the participants, but will instead substitute the time for questions from the participants to the panel, which we can discuss. So I'll just run through this last one very quickly. So we've now established incorrect quality or quantity, and yet, despite that, the contractor has been paid in full. So the contractor built a defective road, but got paid by the road agency for a proper road. Now, could there be any suggestion that the road agency personnel were acting corruptly? Now, interestingly, the whistleblower doesn't say they were. It just says Buildwell was paid in full by the road agency despite the quantity and quality defects. But I think you are justified as an investigator to dig a bit more deeply into this, because could it be that the road agency relied totally on the engineer's certificate and paid? And I think probably you'd say that may be quite fair, because the reason the road agency does appoint an independent engineer is to be able to rely on the engineer's certificate. The engineer is meant to do the hard work of verifying quality and quantity and certifying the payment. So if Buildwell paid in full relying on the engineer's certificate, it could be quite a fair action to do so. Also bear in mind a complexity of construction law is that an engineer's certificate under many construction contracts has interim validity pending appeal. So therefore, under many construction contracts, the road agency is legally obliged to pay the full amount that the engineer certifies, unless and until that amount is overturned in an arbitration or court order. So in many cases, the fact that the road agency paid in full based on the engineer's certificate would be a totally correct legal act by the road agency. But I think you may be entitled as an engineer, as an investigator, to dig a little bit more deeply to see whether there could be any corruption by someone in the road agency. Because if you have a corrupt engineer, you have a corrupt contractor. And also bearing in mind 2 weeks ago, where we discovered that Buildwell had actually got its contract in a cartel, and based on the chief executive of the road agency actually acting corruptly, there's a lot of smell and suspicion about the road agency that there could be corrupt people in the agency. So what would you do? Let's assume that the finance director of the road agency was the person who signed off. You probably start off with the finance director and say, what steps did you take to verify payments before you made it to the contractor? And what steps did you actually take to verify payment? Who did you rely on to verify the payment and make the cash payment, the payment to the contractor? Did anyone instruct you in the road agency to make the payment without checking? Were you lent on in any way by the chief executive or another public official to make the payment? Because normally finance directors are normally reasonably standoffish. They normally don't like making payments unless they actually have the paperwork in place, unless they actually are satisfied. So they're normally a very good place to start. And perhaps you can check whether they received any payment, gift, or entertainment from Buildwell. But you have to tread a bit cautiously here, because there's been no allegation of corruption by the finance director. So you may not be able to dig very deep without any suspicion of corruption. But if you were to suspect corruption, now you'd take very similar steps with the head of finance as you would with the engineer. But it may well be the head of finance is not involved and says, the reason I paid was because the chief executive was really pushing me to pay the contractor. We hadn't got the correct documentation, but I had to pay, and immediately suspicion then falls on the chief executive, which would slot very neatly into our previous workshop, where the chief executive apparently was investigated for leaking information to the or instructing that information should be leaked to the winning contractor. So basically, you're looking for inconsistencies in the finance director's claimed actions. If you're digging deeper, looking into the bank account of the finance director to see if they received any payments, or looking into the bank account of the contractor to see whether they made any suspicious payments to the finance director. And if it's not the finance director responsible for payment to the road agency, then who was responsible? And do the same checks with them. And then if it's correct that the finance director did authorize payment to Buildwell, and the cash payment did actually go to Buildwell, then was the finance director's acts in approving that payment as a public sector body director, did the finance director act reasonably and blamelessly because they were fulfilling their role correctly relying on the documentation provided to them by the engineer and by the contractor? So were they totally blameless? Because they're not on site. They don't have a role on site as a monitor. So were they blameless? Or could they have made an accidental mistake, a mistake in signing, relying on the wrong records? Or could they have been negligent? Should they, as a director, have followed up? Should they have asked more questions? Should they have dug more deeply, than they did? Or do you have evidence they acted deliberately in making the payment? And again, any evidence of entertainment or gifts or hospitality does lead you towards a deliberate payment rather than an accident, which is why we always advise organizations to minimize gifts and hospitality, because it comes back to bite you. So then finally, very briefly, and you've gone through your 3 issues, you've got all the evidence together. Who is responsible? Who are you going to prosecute? So be aware of the fact there could be more than one project participant involved in the corruption. Now, on the 3 issues we've debated, we've found out that the contractor is probably involved in a corrupt payment, claiming quality and quantity which it did not deliver. It could be that the subcontractors and suppliers were also involved in the corruption. They may have fabricated documents. They may have been paid money by the contractor to fabricate documents. The project engineer could be involved in corruptly approving the payment, and the road agency or staff could be involved. So there could be many, many different corrupt parties, or there could be just one corrupt party. You need to be alert to this possibility. And also, when an individual participant is involved in the corruption, you need to consider whether they are involved from their personal perspective, or whether they're acting on behalf of their employer, or both. So if you are a corrupt engineer, corruptly certifying the payment certificate of the contractor, and you work as an individual for an engineering company, are you acting on a limb and yourself accepting a bribe and acting as an individual? Or are you acting under the instructions of your organization, in which case the whole corporation of the project engineer could be corruptly liable? So consider not only the number of different participants and their different roles, but whether they're acting individually or for their corporation. And in many jurisdictions, companies can be liable for corruption in addition to the individuals. So I think I've just covered that slide of all the possible corrupt participants. So then in conclusion, taking into account all your evidence, taking into account all your investigations and your assessment of who's involved and what the likelihood of it is, do you have any admissions of a corrupt act? Have you hit gold? Someone has put their hand up and said, yes, we did it. If not, do you have sufficiently credible witnesses who can give evidence? Has someone broken under your interrogation, or has some employee actually confessed and shopped everyone else in the corrupt act? So do you have a witness? If you don't, then you're going to be relying on your documentary evidence, all the inconsistencies that you've discovered, to enable you to come to an inference of corrupt contract or corrupt conduct. So do you have sufficient evidence in order to put that inference to a court with a reasonable likelihood of success in a court? Or if not, do you think you could obtain more evidence through further detailed investigation? And what further detailed investigation do you need to do to enable you to come to a successful inference? And if you cannot, if you don't have sufficient evidence to have a reasonable prospect of prosecution, then in most cases the prosecution will not be brought. But if you do have a reasonable prospect of prosecution based on admissions, witnesses, or inference, and there's a reasonable chance of success in the prosecution, then it's normally satisfactory to move ahead with the prosecution and take it to the court. So thank you very much. I hope that's been useful. And we have 15 minutes available for questions to the panel. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Neil, for this enriching presentation with a lot of information and techniques, and which is sufficient to equip participants to gain the expertise in investigating corruption. Thank you very much. We have only perhaps less than 15 minutes because we leave some times to Susan if she has some announcement or some point to present to the participant. So before opening the floor, and I wanted to encourage you to use the chat box to send, or the Q&A, to send your questions. And if you have comments, let me make one or two comments. I see that the issue of finance director and its implication in this case of corruption, it could be ambiguous in depending on the jurisdiction, because I'm speaking from my experience, and I wanted to have the opinion of other participants, that usually the finance director, they bear no responsibilities, because their role is to make the payment once the request is approved by the person who is in charge of the project. This is the role because they have to deal with a lot of payment every day, so they don't have time to check and to question the relevance of the payment. All what they do, if they receive an invoice, they will send it to the person who is in charge of the project or in the charge of the procurement, and they will ask for the approval of the invoice, and their role is just technical. But perhaps it's different in some other countries, that I see no responsibility of the finance director, because the process to make a payment is the first is that the site supervisor will prepare the attachment, which means he will certify that the work has been done, and he will set the quantity and the quality and so on, and they testify. Then becomes the role of the site engineer, who will approve. Of course, he will make he will check and review the relevance of the payment and the work that has been done by his assistant. Then he will issue the payment certificate. And at that stage, only perhaps the supervisor and the superior of the site engineer who can make any change and to review the invoice again. But the financial, from my perspective, the finance director has no implication in this, because it's the role of the people who are in charge of the project. The second, I very much appreciated that you described in a very, very excellent manner the factors which complicate the investigation. And one of these factors is that the work items are usually, particularly in civil engineering, the work items are usually concealed by other items. So, and sometimes the contracts that they use this to sometimes divert the attention of the project engineer, because they will make the pouring of concrete in two different sites. So the engineer cannot be in two different sites to check that the steel is put in the quality before pouring the concrete he check the reinforcement of the steel and so on. The second complexity that we can add is usually, and I'm speaking about project civil engineers, projects are spread across multiple sites. If you have a dam, you have building a dam, you have the hub of the dam in one location, but you still have other works that should be done around a highway, etc., etc. The second, another complexity that usually the project involves multiple disciplines, multiple expertise. In one project, you need the expertise of a mechanical engineer, and sometimes the project manager, it's his responsibility to approve that the work has been done, even though it's not his responsibility, because he will rely on another responsibility of the mechanical engineer, because some of the components of the project require the other specialities: mechanical engineer, electrical engineer, geological engineer, civil engineers, and so on. So these are elements add to the complexity of the supervision of the project and the investigations of the project when it happens that corruption is suspected. So with that, I wanted to request the participant to send their comments. I don't see.
Just while we wait for comments,
yes.
Just very briefly, can I just comment? I totally agree with your factors, Kamal. I agree with all the factors you add in, very important ones. I just want to make one comment on the finance director. You're right, and people make comment in the chat that finance director, as you said, has no involvement with the project, but they are the gatekeeper of the public finances or the corporation's finances. They have a duty not to make a payment out unless they're reasonably satisfied that the payment is correct. So they have a duty to satisfy themselves that the underlying procedures and approvals are correct. So they can only go so far. So if they believe the project engineer is honest and has made an honest certification, it would be a reasonable belief. But they do have a duty to keep their eyes open. And I did have an investigation I was involved in where the chief executive was corrupt and instructed the finance director to make sure the contractor was paid. And the finance director did so. Clear breach of duty by the finance director just to take the instruction of the finance chief executive without checking the underlying documents were in case. So your point is correct. They're not involved in the project. They can't be expected to know, but they must, in my view, fulfill their responsibility of fiduciary responsibility to believe that the procedures and processes are being properly managed. So they do have to step down and open their eyes. That's all I'll comment. So, but in reality, they're not involved and they won't know the detail. That is quite correct.
There are a few questions in the Q&A. If we could also address those, please.
We have Alex who made some comments. Alex, do you want to come live? Perhaps you have made 2 or 3 relevant comments. Perhaps you can share them. No. The question, if you wanted to address his last question, Neil, how many convictions are achieved in your experience without a whistleblower's witness? Oh,
I'm going to definitely pass that question to Mike, if Mike is happy to take that one.
Yeah.
Excuse me. The question is, how many convictions are obtained?
Without a
whistleblower or witness.
Well, very, very few. I would say that just off the top of my head, and I hope it's accurate, that most construction fraud cases in most environments are not detected, and those that are detected, very few of them are proven. And I can say this from my own experience when I was doing investigations for the World Bank and others. The vast majority of our cases were procurement cases because we didn't understand construction fraud. I hate to admit it, but we didn't understand it. We didn't have Neil available to teach us what to do. And so unless there was a very unhappy contractor who was paying bribes and didn't like it and came forward and admitted the bribes and admitted the related frauds, there was virtually no opportunity to prove it. So there are cases that you'll read where construction frauds are detected, and usually begins with fraudulent works. Why did the bridge collapse? Why is the road no good? And good solid investigation proved the fraud. And then the question is, why did the inspector improve fraudulent works? And step by step, you can get to the bribes. It's possible, but unfortunately, it's so complicated, so demanding that it's not generally accomplished. And that's why I think, just to wrap this up, I don't want to go on, that's why this training is so important, to actually start to move anti-corruption training from procurement into construction, because it is so important. You know, there's going to be $100 trillion of infrastructure investments in the next 15 years. And we really need to understand better how to identify, improve, and prevent fraud and corruption in these projects.
Another comment, it's when we talk about the project engineer, we expect the engineer to be at site and the consultant full-time. I think this was made after my comment. Of course, we are not, the engineer should be at site full-time, but the problem when we talk about big, large-scale projects with multiple sites. And this is also, it's happened sometimes. Engineer they have in charge projects with a number of sites and number of components, so they cannot be everywhere every time where concrete is poured, or every time when you have sensitive work being done. So this is what during these phases some corruption can occur in this. Because there are a number of vulnerabilities also in the project. You cannot appoint many engineers to be in charge of one project. And sometimes you have engineers who are in charge of 2 or 3 projects, and they are in different sites, so that the supervision could sometimes become challenging. But as you know, there is personal responsibility related to this field. This is questioned by Najib Khabouchi. But as you know, there is personal responsibility related to this field, but there is also the collective responsibility of all the management. Absolutely, yeah. Neil, do you see that any question that you wanted to comment?
No, I think not. I mean, it's been. I'm just wondering if Susan, will need the last 4 minutes to conclude, or whether there's time for any other wrap up. I've got nothing further to add.
Okay.
Okay, so thank you very much, Neil. Thank you for all participants for their perseverance, and we will end this journey within 2 weeks. And now it's over to you, Susan, if you have some announcement to make.
Okay.
Thank you, Mike, for your very valuable comments.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Kamel, Mike, and Neil for the presentation. There have been some positive feedback in the chat already concerning the discussions we've had on today's topic. There are still some questions in the Q&A, Neil. If you would want to just type an answer to them, that would be great. Either yourself, also Kamel or Michael, you could just address and type the answers there, right, in the Q&A. So yes, as Kamel has already said, we are at the end of this training and the anti-corruption training of trainers program on preventing and investigating corruption. And we've been on this journey since October last year. This is 8 months now, and by next month, June, we should be rounding up fully. I want to say thank you again, adding my voice to all the thanks that have come already for your participation, for the enthusiasm with which you have followed through this this training program, and I want to invite us all to be present for the final closing session, which will be happening in 2 weeks on the 11th of June. We'll be meeting to do our final evaluation of the training and some feedback from the evaluation that was conducted on the conflict of interest sessions. This was done with Kamel, and he will be having some feedback on that as to how we'll be accompanying those who are interested in further professional development around conflict of interest. So look out for all of that. Also, we'll be discussing about the certification and trainer qualification process. So please look out for that also in that session. And let me just note quickly that we'll be sharing an evaluation. We'll ask that you kindly evaluate the training as you have accompanied us all through from whenever you joined along the course of this journey, so that we can, improve on the delivery in time to come and in other trainings that we'll be organizing. All right. So please note that certification will be tied to the completion, of your evaluation, and we look forward to your feedback concerning this training. And this will be all for me to you today. I want to thank you again for all on the panel, Mr. Neil Stansbury, who has been our speaker today, our presenter, and Mr. Kamel Ayadi, who has been our able moderator, and always with us all through, Mr. Michael Kramer, and bringing in some useful insights also to our discussions. Thank you also to all of you who have made time to be with us today and to bring in all your inputs, your suggestions, your comments, your insights in the discussions that we've had today. I believe it has been a good session for all of us together in today's TOT 15. So we'll see you in 2 weeks' time. If anybody on the panel has any further comments, this will be all from me to us all today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Okay, then.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Good.
Bye.
Then it's bye from us.
Bye.
Yeah. Thank you. Bye-bye.